Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. This is about the 80th take I make of this video, my August wrap up. It was supposed to be posted last week. It failed. Everything failed. But here I am trying again because I want to talk to you about these books that I read because I read some really fun stuff. I'm also going to try and make this video shorter than the original 40 minutes where I just kept rambling and none of it made sense. I don't know how to talk about these books. It's like they're good, but there's so much I want to say, but I let too much time pass, and so it would have been something where maybe if I had notes it would have helped, but I don't have that habit of taking notes while I read. Maybe that's something I can develop, but in any case, let's get started. Let's get started with what is a continuation of my July reading. In July, I read Jules Verne De la Terre à la Lune, which is from the Earth to the Moon. And so in August, I read the sequel Autour de la Lune, Around the Moon. Now, I read this because this was a book I had chosen to read in July, and it ended on this major cliffhanger that I wasn't aware of. So fortunately, I was in Paris at the time, and I was able to read the sequel. Unfortunately, though, the sequel was not as exciting as the original book in the duology, and actually the sequel was very boring. So boring. Oh my goodness. So the thing about Jules Verne is that, like, his best books will be a perfect mix of adventure and science. Or some of his best books, in my personal preference, will also just be pure adventure. However, in Autour de la Lune, he has gone way too much on the science side, and he loses his reader. Now, you have to take into consideration the plot of the book. Basically, we have three travelers who are in this sort of space capsule that they created in book one, and now they are traveling around the moon. Now, this is taken in the late 1800s, so obviously taking into consideration when the book takes place, also taking consideration when the book was written, all the observations of the moon are absolutely fascinating, super fascinating. Like the idea of writing about what the moon looks like from so close, which makes sense because we have three very science-based travelers on this capsule. It makes sense. But as a modern reader, the fact that we can Google the moon and 3 seconds later we have a picture of the moon and we know exactly what the moon looks like. We already know that the moon is inhabitable. We know basically there's no water, there are no living beings, etc. We know that. So having to read all of that in this book, and it's about a 320 page book. I would say about 250 pages of those are just scientific observation. And reading page after page of, oh, well, this crater is 100,000 kilometers from this crater, and this crater is 92,000 kilometers from this crater. Oh, well, let's talk about the mountains. Well, this mountain is so many kilometers high, and this mountain is so many kilometers high. Like, those observations are just not necessary. That's not information that's going to stick into your head. And even if it did, the information is outdated because with modern technology, we're going to have more precise measurements of all of that. So I started skimming all the science bits. Every time there was any sort of calculation or estimation, I just skimmed over those, got a feel for it so that I could keep the wonderment, the feeling of wonder, the feeling of discovery, and the feeling of excitement that our travelers are experiencing. Like, I try to keep that energy up, but I definitely skimmed ahead to the bits where the plot sort of would go forward, or maybe the travelers would speak amongst themselves, saying things other than just, oh, this is what the moon looks like. So unfortunately, pretty boring, but still amazing and fascinating to read, taking this book into its like historical context and just like the context of Jules Verne and what he does very well. So fun, but not fun at the same time. But I'm still glad that I read this duology. It was a really good experience. Moving on to another book that I didn't really like before we go into the books that I did quite like. I read Pêche dans le Tohoku by Numata Shinsuke. This is the French translation of the book 80, the translation done by Patrick Honoré. And the French translation is fishing in Tohoku. Tohoku being the northernmost region of the main island of Japan, right before Hokkaido. And I read this because it's an Akutagawa Prize winner, and I follow the Akutagawa Prize quite seriously because it's an excellent prize. There's so many good things that come out of it, and you can bet that if you win the Akutagawa Prize, it's very likely that your works are going to be pushed outside of Japan and they'll be translated into other languages. So it's a very prestigious prize. It very often focuses on the social aspects of Japan, which is something that I really enjoy, just so I can get a feel for the life of the people around me, basically. So I'm always going to pick up any book that won the prize, basically. But this one just failed for me. It's basically just about this man and his relationship, his male friendship relationship with a man at his work as they just go fishing in the fabulous Tohoku and all the nature and whatnot, until one day his friend just sort of disappears. And I don't know, this book didn't do anything for me. I found it quite boring. I didn't understand what it was trying to say. Was it trying to look at male relationships in modern Japan? Was it like trying to look at is there a distance between work relationships and actual friendly relationships? I just didn't really understand what it was trying to say. And it mentions like the Fukushima tsunami, and then which just I just didn't know where it came from, because nothing came out of that story either. Nothing came out of that sort of conversation. And then our protagonist is in a relationship, and they broke up because his partner transitioned and became a woman, and nothing was explored in that area too. That dynamic just did nothing. It just sat there. It was just kind of thrown out there, and it didn't seem to do anything for a character. And considering that this is such a character focused book, you would think that would do something, but it just did nothing. And so the original title of 80 meaning like shade in the shadows. So it's just, what is that title even trying to represent? Is it just sort of like what we show of ourselves on the surface level, and then in the shadows, who are we behind that? Yeah, you could say that for sure. Okay, the book focuses on that, but for me, I just didn't get anything out of this book. Now, I looked at Japanese reviews, and the Japanese version of like Goodreads or library thing, they were very positive. A lot of them seemed to get a lot out of this book. So maybe this is just me and my opinions, but I thought this failed. Not my book. So next, moving on, let's talk about two nonfiction books that I read this month. The first one being Memoir d'un eunuque dans la cité interdite, Memoirs of a Eunuch in the Forbidden City, written by Shi Dan. So this is important to note, because the thing is that this is the Memoirs of a Eunuch, but Shi, the writer, is not the eunuch himself. Shi writes about another eunuch called Yu Chunhei, who was a eunuch within the Forbidden City, and basically just writes his memoirs, but writes it in a very sort of fictionalized manner. When you read this, or when I read it, I very much question like what part of this is fictionalized, what part of this is imagined, what part of this is exaggerated. And because of that, I sort of lost the nonfiction aspect of this book, and it became kind of emotionally confusing. So in terms of like the actual history base of the eunuch and what they did, all of that was very accurate to what I've read in other books that focus on this topic, but it just read almost too much like a novel. Like I love narrative nonfiction, but this was so narrative that it bordered on fiction for me. But it's still interesting to read. You get the story of Yu Junhei in his early adolescence, before he becomes a eunuch, when he was living poor, he was serving for a family. He had to take care of his father. And then one day he sort of gets into trouble because he falls for this girl who is being targeted by his employer's sort of shit show of a son, basically. Let's call it what it is. So he gets into trouble, he flees, and he gets caught by his uncle, who sells him to the Forbidden City, at which point he gets fully castrated, becomes a eunuch, enters the Forbidden City. He doesn't, he's not a eunuch for the Dowager Empress, who I read nonfiction of previously, either, I think it was last year I read that. But he is in the Forbidden City and he does make observations. However, I would say this is very much a story about the eunuch themselves, what they did, and it has not really too much commentary on the political side of this time period. This is just really about Yu Junhei and his life. I thought the aspect of the whole idea of children basically being kidnapped to become eunuchs was quite fascinating. His life within the Forbidden City definitely mirrors what I've read in other nonfiction, so that seemed very, very accurate. And then the end, where the Forbidden City, all of that pretty much gets shut down, and we leave the system, and he goes to work for another eunuch. I thought that part of the story was quite interesting. It also gave me one of the most horrific, please stop talking about this because I want to vomit, kind of scenes, where basically the eunuch he works for has a fetish of using his wife's mouths as spittoons. And I don't mean like watered down spit. I mean like full on, like phlegm, spitting phlegm into these gross, so disgusting. I don't know why I shared that with you. Maybe because I want you to be as grossed out as I am, because share the love. Wow, that was vomit inducing. But yeah, so it was very good. I really enjoyed this. But it just definitely had a feel where it's a little bit too fictionalized. How much is it all real, basically? But still very, very interesting. Now, the nonfiction I liked even more than that, and I just thought it was so much fun to read, was Les Alpinistes de Mao, so Mao's Alpinists by Cédric Gras. This is a recent release. It really just released in 2023 because the author wrote this while we were during the COVID lockdown, basically. His previous book being The Alpinists of Stalin, which I haven't read. This is my first introduction to this author. But this was really, really fascinating. It was a really good look at Mao's China and the Tibet revolution and Tibet's fighting against China as China tried to basically steal Tibet away. It was a good look at that in a way where it put that all in the background, so you got the political atmosphere, but you focused on this concept where Mao, who wanted to show China's prowess, China's power, China's ability to do anything, and even better than the West. Mao's obsession with doing that gave him the idea of sending some of his own people to conquer Mount Everest. Now, that is all well an idea, except for the fact that China has no idea what alpinism is. They have no history of climbing mountains. And the people they get to conquer this feat or to accomplish this feat have never even seen a mountain themselves. This book focusing on two people specifically, Zhu Xing and Yu Lianmang. But they had never even hiked a mountain, hiked a hill, nothing. They had no experience before. So the idea of plucking these people and suddenly sending them to Everest is basically seems just unrealistic, and it seems basically deemed to fail. So you follow the story of them, they train with the Russians, and then they start their adventure of trying to conquer Everest. Obviously, the civil war in Tibet sort of makes the adventure a little bit more difficult. There's a lot of postponements. There's a lot of problems with a lot of alpinists dying, for example, because they are frankly unprepared, don't have the proper equipment, and they just don't have the experience to be conquering Everest, let alone some of the smaller mountains in the region. So it became this really, really fascinating story. I love the sense of humor and sort of sense of sarcastic commentary that Cédric Gras enters into the book, especially because he mentions stuff like how China turns like this event into sort of a legend almost. And us Chinese, we were able to do this, and something that the Western foreigners were never able to do themselves. And then they are very proud of the fact that they were able to accomplish something. But then Cédric Guy goes, oh yeah, they are very proud that they accomplished something, and it only took them 5 years to do it. And then the Indian party accomplished it in a week. So there's a lot of like witty, sarcastic humor in that really just like points out the fact that, yeah, I mean, China, I think, can be proud that they were able to accomplish something, because they did build alpinism all the way from zero. But the fact of the matter is they were reckless and they were dangerous, and they needed to remove their pride and really focus on how realistic was this task. So it was just super, super interesting. I really loved it. I just, like, seriously, I love the tidbits where, I mean, obviously the two people, they were part of the Communist Party, but they were part of the Communist Party sort of, it seems, in the sense where, like, you're just trying to survive. It's not necessarily that you believe in the politics, it's not necessarily that you believe in Mao's China, but the fact is you have to pretend you do so that you can survive. And so the author will mention how in the documents in all the documents of the time period, it would say something like, oh yes, our comrades were energized by the words of Mao to lift them to the top of Mount Everest. And our author would be like, well, it doesn't seem like he lifted them too far, since they all died on the way up there, So like it's just really full of quite a bit of humor that was just really, really fun to read. I do think it helps to be already quite well versed in the time period when you read this, because some of the writing at times it's a little choppy. It kind of jumps a little bit here and there, especially at the beginning, although the author mentions it himself that because there was no interest in these two characters until they were actually formally trained and they were properly going on these expeditions, there's not much about their childhood, how they grow up, also the fact that, yeah, they're trying to protect themselves from the Communist Party. They were very they spoke very little about their adventures, just as sort of basically, out of means of survival in terms of trying to protect themselves and their family. So there are times where there's not really that much information, and so Cédric Gras kind of has to imagine sort of some of the conversations and sort of some of what they might have imagined, or he sort of has to like rebuild their journey from scratch, or maybe not from scratch, but has to rebuild it at least from like very little clues that come from the records. So because of that, you do have to take certain passages more lightly, because it's just the information isn't there, it doesn't exist for Cédric Gras to really be able to give the most accurate account of what happened, basically. But nevertheless, this is super, super fascinating. Really, really love this. If you can read French, definitely recommend picking this up. And if it gets translated ever, I definitely also recommend picking it up, because it's really, really fun and really interesting to read. I'll be interested in reading the Alpinists of or Stalin's Alpinists to see how that reads, basically, is what I guess I'm trying to say. Now, the next book is probably my favorite book of the year so far. Absolutely loved reading this, and that is Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was meant to just be one of those books I read as an ebook while I'm at work. So basically I was expecting to read like maybe 10 pages, 15 pages a day, no faster than that of a reading pace. And that didn't happen because I was immediately hooked. And this became my 24-hour book. And I read this in like 4 or 5 days. I was just absolutely fascinated by this book. I could not put it down. When I wasn't reading it, all I was thinking about was when can I read it, because it was thrilling. It was legitimately frightening. It had some just scenes that were just thrilling, and really just made you want to turn the page. The boat scene, the scenes with Lucy, the final chases, the initial like 50 pages with Jonathan Harker meeting Dracula. It was absolutely fascinating and just legitimately frightening. And the thing is, like, it's told in a way where it's not a general fiction narrative. It's told in memoirs, it's told in telegrams and letters, newspaper clippings, and it's so good at really making you want to turn the page. You send out for a telegram, and you're like, okay, well, what's going to come back? What kind of answer is going to come back? The telegram comes back like, oh my goodness, this is the answer. What are we going to do? So now you want to move on to find out what they're going to do, and who are they going to meet, and how is Dracula, what's like his, it's just fascinating. You cannot stop looking forward to what's going to come next because it's absolutely thrilling. And this was just so much fun to finally meet the original characters, because we've all seen so many adaptations of Dracula, but I had to say they're all meaningless compared to the original work. The original work is absolutely wonderful, super wonderful. It's just so good. So to meet Jonathan Harker, to meet Dracula, to meet Mina and Lucy, to meet Van Helsing, Dr. Van Helsing, it's just absolutely I'm telling you, I was just absolutely hooked. I just love this. I mean, the only other adaptation that I think of Dracula that I like is the Buffy the Vampire Dracula, and that is just because it's so absurd and so comical, and it's such it's so not Dracula at all, but and it, like, even within the Buffy lore, it contradicts the vampire lore in Buffy. So that was just really fun. But other than that, seriously, Dracula, the original work is the best. All the adaptations actually are quite just not, they're just not up to par. This is just absolutely fantastic. Loved this. So probably my favorite book of the year so far. The last book I read, and this is one of the books that I struggled talking about in my previous videos because there is so much I would want to talk about. There was so much that I want to go with, share experiences about, share personal anecdotes about, and it just got so messy. So I'm just going to keep it very basic because otherwise I just don't know how to talk about this book. And that is Passing by Nella Larsen. Now the story focuses on our protagonist who one day meets a friend of hers from back in her school days. And the thing is that these are both Black women in 1920s America. And they have been living very different lives because in the sense that although they can both pass as white women because of their very light skin tone, our protagonist has chose to live a typical Black American life, married a Black man, lives in Black society, lives in Black Harlem, lives in Black Harlem, and is part of the sort of, they're friends with the very strong Black intellectual movement. Is movement the right word? I don't even know if that's the right word. But basically all her friends are like the literature greats of the time period, all the wonderful actors and actresses, the playwrights, etc., while her friend has decided to use her light skin tone to pass as a white woman, marries a white man. And the book, basically the tension of the book starts when our protagonist meets the husband of her former friend and realizes that he is very much racist against Black men, and against Black people in general, and doesn't even realize he's married to a Black woman himself. So the tension really comes from that. And it's absolutely it's a beautiful book, to be honest. The way it explores this concept of whiteness, what it is, so whiteness versus Blackness, Black identity, white identity, this concept of passing. Is passing just something that is related to the skin tone, or are Black people at the time period always trying to passing by limiting their culture, by limiting their sort of experiences, by limiting just themselves as a whole to sort of pass into white society and to be considered acceptable by white citizens. So that whole concept is very much taken into consideration. We see our protagonist, who again, she's incredibly successful. She has a husband who's a doctor. She's surrounded by these amazing intellectual minds who just happen to be Black. But even with that, she's still considered a minor in society just because she's not white, or because none of them are white, basically. So a lot of that is looked upon. And then another part that I found really fascinating was this concept of like Black identity, especially when it comes to the concept of Black community, where part of the friction and the tension that comes from this book is our protagonist feels very much uncomfortable having this woman as her friend. She feels unsafe. She's worried about what the husband will do when he finds out that his wife is Black. And she just doesn't feel like this is a safe friendship to have, and she wants to cut it off. But she feels very much sort of not even attached to, but she feels almost forced by her Black identity that she has to support her friend to show that she's supporting the Black community, because the one thing that the Black community does not need is to have Blacks fighting against each other when they're already having to fight against the idea of them being a minority, basically. So there's already too much tension to add more to it. So she's really fighting with this idea of Black community, that we should support our own, no matter what it is, because if we don't support each other, then the white people will definitely win. So all of that to say, there's so much in this book. I loved the depictions of Black Harlem at the time. It's a beautiful book. It's just really, really well done. And I'm very much looking forward to the Netflix movie to see how well they portray the two women and the tension between them. I think if done well, the movie could be very, very good. So yeah, that's what I read in the month of August. I'm feeling much better about this video. That went a lot better than all the previous attempts that I've made. And I'll try to get it up by Sunday evening, although it might be Monday by the time you watch this, because I have to go now and do other things. So I don't know if I have time to edit anything. In any case, yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!